Our topic here in this panel is what we're calling the real economy, by which I think this is the private sector opportunity to create a lot of jobs and for those to be decent jobs. And clearly we face a massive challenge even under conventional assumptions about the future of the macro economy. We heard Min Zhu in the previous session give a relatively gloomy outlook on global growth of the old-fashioned kind. And if we have some of these other scenarios that we've been talking about for technology change and so forth, it could be an even dicier situation. We already have millions of young people out of work around the world, and more people doing jobs that are not fulfilling, are paying less than they used to, and so forth. And so this is a huge challenge. And I want to start, Reeta, with you. Talk a bit about youth unemployment and this real danger that I think exists that we may lose a significant number of people they may lose their opportunity to have a fulfilling career because of our failure to act.
So I think the facts are really well known in terms of that youth unemployment.
Could I ask for quiet in the room, please, as well? Thanks.
I think the facts are well known that youth unemployment is usually 2 to 3 times higher than adult unemployment. And in some parts of the world, particularly in the parts where the MasterCard Foundation works in sub-Saharan Africa, when you combine that with rapid growth rates but a lack of inclusion, rapid growth rates but not necessarily high numbers of jobs being produced, and you take that in the convergence of significant growth in terms of the population under the age of 30, some people could say that's a recipe for disaster. It certainly could be on one hand. On the other hand, if we make the right investments in education, make the right investments in sectors which are growing, and in Africa, the economy is practically synonymous with agriculture or agribusiness, then we need to look at how we raise productivity rates. But it's also a question about not just of education, but the right skills, networks which connect young people to employers, and access to finance, which are absolutely critical. And it calls on multiple stakeholders, not just business. Business is a clear, a major player, but we all know that the informal economy far dwarfs the formal economy. So government has to play a very critical role in terms of sending out the right policy incentives, as does civil society.
And do you see anything working out there, that any of these partnerships that have been created to try and address the youth unemployment problem, are any of them bearing fruit yet? Are we learning any lessons?
I think there are a few lessons, but I would say it's early days, and we're certainly involved in some of them. So the first big gap is data, and we have a partnership with the ILO, which is actually looking to address those kinds of gaps, data and evidence. And so one critical aspect is really understanding trends in terms of youth unemployment, but actually going below the surface and understanding the differentiation, the issues facing rural youth versus urban youth, migration patterns, the issues facing girls versus young men. So that's one key thing. But in terms of what we are learning is that it really takes a much more holistic approach. So first and foremost is doing something I don't think we do very, very well at all, which is listening and also engaging young people, engaging them not just in terms of their aspirations, but also in the design, in the implementation, and the evaluation of programs. So we're getting that direct feedback. Second is really taking a hard look at market assessments and understanding which sectors are growing and where are there high potential for absorption of millions of young people into the economy. And third is actually designing programs which engage the sectors I alluded to a moment ago, government, the education sector, and employers.
Now, Nigel, you've taken on one of these new roles at the World Bank as part of the restructuring that moves across the traditional silos and looks at job policy across the board. Just tell us a bit about why that change has been made and what you hope that will bring to the World Bank's ability to help countries as they figure out how to solve their job problems.
So the last thing I want to do is scare away the audience by boring you with internal World Bank bureaucracy stories. And it's also bad practice to disagree with your chair.
But
You see, I mean, I listened really carefully to the last two panels, as I'm sure everybody did, and I got this sense of, and I respect everyone on those panels immensely, of course, but I ended up with this aggregate sense of, we've got this under control, guys. We know what we're doing. We, trust us. And I think we have to start, which comes back to the World Bank restructuring, of acknowledging the scale of the challenge and actually how little that we have done that seems to be working to the scale that is needed. If I may, let me just illustrate with the African continent, because you can, I think, learn usefully from extremes. So most African countries have had strategies geared around economic growth, but that's overwhelmingly been jobless growth. Mm-hmm. So we've had, an average of 5-6% a year, not shabby. But the best projections on formal employment, the numbers increase over the next decade by 50% or so, but from such a tiny base, it just doesn't begin to touch the scale of the problem. So it's been a kind of jobless growth, so just pushing for growth without thinking through what an inclusive growth strategy would look like. The second that you just touched on is the informality issue. Our projections, however optimistic they are, say that the informal sector in Africa will maybe drop from the current something like 90% across the continent to maybe 80% if we keep our fingers really crossed and everything goes right.
By when?
By over the next decade. Mm-hmm. So again, nothing commensurate with the scale of the challenge. And the third, I just want to pick on, you've asked in the last panel this technology question. And maybe this is the one that worries me most, that you've talked about this trend, this model of the last 40 years of outsourcing of manufacturing tasks from industrialized countries to poorer developing countries. And you've seen this very nice pattern, particularly in East Asia, of going from growth that's light manufacturing through to more heavy industrial and now into the services sector. But when we look at robotics, when we look at that exponential use of robotics in the manufacturing sector, I think in the next 3 or 4 years, that option of the first step on the jobs agenda being light manufacturing is just not going to be there for country after country. And I think we haven't begun to think through what can take its place. So again, I agree with everything that was said, but unless we acknowledge the scale of the challenge ahead of us, not just the 600 million jobs that are needed to be created over the next 10, 15 years to keep pace with the new entrants in the job market, but the scale of some of these challenges, I think we run the risk of this audience walking out and saying, oh, it's okay, it's under control. And it isn't.
So, Minister, what do you think? Under control, or are we still not really facing up to the reality of the challenges? I mean, Bangladesh obviously sends enormous numbers of people abroad. That's why they have a minister for expatriates. But also you are a place that has relied on supply chains from abroad and not always happily so. How do you view this challenge?
The labor migration will always continue. Look at the demographic situation in parts of Africa and in our part of the world. The median age is about 14 to 30 years, meaning that increasing number of people are coming to the job markets. On the contrary, in Europe and in America, the median age is about 40 plus, indicating that there is always declining labor supply and aging population to support. So this demographic imbalance and need to sustain the growth and economic development, this labor migration will continue to increase. So, and we in Bangladesh are preparing ourselves to gear up our population to meet the challenges for the future demand of the world.
So how do you think about that? I mean, do you sit there and say, well, how do we train our population to send a large amount of them overseas?
No, what we're making some efforts. You know, we are preparing our people, you know, through our media, through consultations. We go to the rural areas, and there is a risk, very serious risk involved, exploitation, you know. And we have to take care of these serious exploitation issues. What we have done, you know, previously, a migrant would pay a tremendous amount of money for which to even recover his migration costs. He might have to work for 3 years before ever he can recover his costs. Now we have eliminated this system by introducing labor registration through our 4,000 centers in rural centers. We register people who are willing to migrate. We have a database of something like 2.2 million workers in 48 categories of works. And as the demand comes along, we select them on random basis and give them opportunity to travel abroad. And to prepare them, we have intensive training facilities. You know, currently, we're working with 72 training centers spread all over the countries. We are planning to expand it to 500. So meaning that we'll have an annual training capacity of more than 600,000 people a year. So these efforts are, you know, in a way, preventing exploitation, and we are also training right people for the right job.
Now, Sharan Burrow, General Secretary of the International Trade Union, what do you feel? I mean, we've been describing this extraordinary transforming global economy, a rising expectation that we want to have inclusive growth and decent work, and yet actually, as Nigel just said, in reality, a record that is not all that encouraging of doing the stuff on the scale that needs to be done to achieve those two objectives. I mean, how do you think we should be approaching this huge challenge?
Well, thank you. And first of all, let me apologise. It's as hard to get out of the UN as it is to get in. But, I mean, I'm sure that people have already said this, but workers now are on the front lines of fear from both the impact of the resounding longevity of serious historic unemployment levels out of the financial crisis, and of course the impact on climate change. You know, I just gave the example in a panel at the UN about, as we go to Lima, the Peruvian fisherman who tells us, Xavier's his name, Xavier Castro, tells us that in fact, you know, they only were able to catch 50% of their fish quotas last year. That's not enough to live on, and it's not enough to actually pay for social protection or pensions into the long term. So we have to do something serious. And, you know, Guy's been a fantastic advocate of, you know, absolutely driving a renewed approach. But at the L20 last week, we tried to shift the agenda. We tried to say, well, look, if you need to really look at how you drive growth and jobs, then you've got to go back to the fundamentals. If there is no demand in the global economy, and you've had a wage share in at least the G20 countries, a drop of something like 10% of wage share over 3 decades, and we're talking 80% of the wealth, then you've got to start to put wages back on the agenda. So if we're talking growth and demand and jobs growth, or we're talking inequality, then you've got to look at what the dominant model of our trading system has delivered. And it's actually delivering impoverished workers, stagnant demand, and we've got to turn that around. But at the same time, we have to do that in a way that transitions us to a sustainable economy. So we have to build in now the design pieces that build the jobs of the future. And I thought, reading Guy's press release, actually, with the joint project, that there were two really instructive pieces in that. One is that we know what the pain will look like for some of our workers, but we support a zero carbon future, and we want the industrial transformation to get there, which has to come through social dialogue. And the fact that 80% of the high-emitting industries only, in fact, employ 10% of the labour force means we've got a chance. If we add to that some formalising the informal sector, if we look at the role of women, then frankly we're looking to both the industrial dialogue we need, and the ILO's central to that, but we're also looking to the development goals to be serious about, again, the ambition of full employment and decent work. Because if you're not, and you're not serious about universal social protection, then we're not actually talking about what we need to do to put the dignity of work back into the heart of our communities.
So, do you feel workers are ready to make the sacrifices that are required to move to a green economy, or is there a lot we have to do more to help them make that shift?
Workers are already making the sacrifice. I mean, leave aside industries like coal, where we have to do some specific transitional planning. If you think about who's the victim of the current economy that's not working, it's working people. 40% of the global economy is informal. The predominant numbers of women and young people have no confidence that they'll have decent work, let alone that their children will get the integrated approach to education and care that they need or their parents need. So we know that we have to make the transition, and we want the social dialogue to make that possible. What we're looking for is a progressive business community that's willing to actually sit down and say we've got to make the changes, and it's got to be about decent work. It can't be about just safety nets. It's got to be social protection if you're going to give people confidence that they are going to make the transition. So that's integrated income support, skills development, help for redeployment, and so on. It's not going to be easy, but it's actually a huge set of opportunities. If you look at even our research in 2010, but again, the figures the ILO use that show that even in the renewable sector today, we're already generating millions of jobs, and we can treble that by 2030. I mean, we did research in 2010 that showed you could have 48 million new jobs in just 12 countries if you invested, 2% over 5 years. So there's a lot that we can do, but we've got to have the will to do it.
Now, Reeta, I mean, how important is it that this sort of issue of the informal economy versus the formal economy? And I know you do a lot of work on financial inclusion, but I mean, this broader issue of moving from informality to formality, how significant is that as part of the solution?
Well, I think you have to take as a reality just how large the informal economy is, and some would argue, even just after listening to what Nigel said a moment ago, that the informal economy for right now, at least for the next several years, will be the real economy, which many people find themselves in. And absolutely, I think the points which Sharan raised around social protection, ensuring decent work, safety, particularly safety for women and young girls who find themselves in a working situation.
So what works in dealing with an informal economy and providing, jobs that don't really exist officially with the kind of protections that you would if they were formal?
The facts are that those jobs do exist,
yeah.
and young people are actually working in many of those jobs. And so clearly the most critical thing still remains skills, networks, skills in terms of preparing young people for work, whether it is, even in the informal economy. I'll give you a couple examples. So one of, and again, these are glimmers in terms of what evidence could look like in the future. So we have a substantial investment in East Africa, working with an organization called TechnoServe, which works in our project works in Rwanda, Uganda, and Kenya, and it's all focused on helping young people, rural young people, find pathways to employment. It could be on-farm or off-farm employment. And it's much more than just a supply and demand of training, but it's really understanding where are the growth areas within those value chains, and where are the opportunities for young people to actually access financing, mentoring, and support. And what we're noticing a year out, even longer, after that training, income's actually growing. So at baseline, incomes in Kenya might have been, and these are small, obviously very low incomes before training, $22 a month. And now a year out, $88 a month. So the trend's going up in the right directions, but it comes back with a provision of skills, right skills, and it's also support. People don't often like to talk about support, but support which extends well beyond that training, in checking in with young people, helping them network, helping them actually learn how to present themselves and to make the right connections. I think that's absolutely critical. I do want to come back and say something also. Given how the economy is changing, I think this is also a right time for educational institutions to think about how they reinvent themselves. The world of education and the world of employment seldom connect, and they're not really part of the same conversation. And part of the work, again, from government funders like ourselves and others, is to ensure that employers are in the classroom and vice versa, so that young people are actually learning something which is relevant, which is going to really equip them with employable skills, and there are pathways to find those employers or to entrepreneurial opportunities.
But the solutions are ones we know. I mean, you've touched on them, but they are about what does it take to formalise a job. It takes a secure contract of employment. Mm-hmm. It takes a minimum wage on which you can live. It actually is about a social protection that allows you the transition, and it is about skills and the link with work. You know, large corporations used to actually fund structured training, and we've challenged jointly business and labour, the G20, to help us scale up apprenticeships, because when you look at the decline in structured investment in training by big corporations, it's an appalling loss. If we're going to include young people, let's get them back into a model where they are supported to both work and train. And of course, the other issues go even way beyond those formal sector guarantees. You know, the business community says to us, we need more trade liberalisation, we need you to stand against protectionism with us. I say, fine, we'll do all of that, but first of all, you have to make a commitment to purge your supply chains of forced labour and informal work. And when you take responsibility, we can work with you to put those other elements at risk. But, you know, we've got now workers in Cambodia who are being shot and jailed for striking for a minimum wage. Same in Indonesia, they've been jailed. In, you know, Bangladesh, you know about the safe work and the accord that the ILO with Union Industrial are doing terrific work around. But we've got to change the model of responsibility around safe and secure work with fundamental rights that allow for sustainable incomes. And then we'll see that you'll do something about demand, but you'll also do something about the other issues around sustainable futures.
Well, let me pick that up with the Minister. I mean, covering the sort of aftermath of Rana Plaza last year, I mean, I had a lot of very interesting conversations with the business community and the activist community. And there was this sort of sense that I got that the business community felt it was doing everything, you know, certainly the leading companies were doing everything they could, but they felt the problem lay in government not enforcing its own rules. And I wonder to what extent you feel that was a fair characterization. But secondly, you know, what have you seen working since? And everyone has sort of been focused on your particular garment industry and
thank you,
in terms of how that's a model for anywhere else.
Thank you, Matthew. The Rana Plaza is a tragedy which nobody has ever expected, you know. This was related to a building collapse, you know. It's not a job environment or any other issues. And unfortunately, in one building alone, it housed 3 factories, which was not right. And the factory building itself was very poorly designed or poorly constructed. And it was a bit far away from the industrial belt. So it was not within our inspection purview. Nobody has ever looked with the capacity of the building. So this accident, this collapse has given us a tremendous shock. And we, together with our partners, who are, this is in the garment sector, you must know that we are employing around 3.5 to 4 million people in this sector alone, in 3,500 factories. So it's a huge labor-intensive work. So we have now created inspection teams, with our engineering university experts. And, main reason for these accidents is the factory owners sometimes, or most of the times, they block the path, an emergency exit path, to protect their goods against pilferage, or I don't know what. Electrical installation is most of the time is defective. So through these inspections, we have been able to dismantle or discontinue with 29 factories. Rest of the factories, most of them are found in an operative condition, but many of them need some restructuring, which we are doing. After Rana Plaza, there has been 8 incidences of fire. Unfortunately, there has been no casualties. Because of our serious inspection capacity, we have increased our inspection capacities threefold within a period of 6 months' time. It used to be something like 300 inspectors. Now we have something like 900.
And to what extent do you think that the multinational companies that were working in your country could have done more to protect the workers?
Yeah, we have been talking to them very seriously. To deal with this huge amount of workforce, it needs something a little more than what normal things are prescribed. Now, the factory owners in my country are mostly first generation of entrepreneurs. So they also lack some serious training or serious insight how they should work with this labor force. Thanks to ILO, Mr. Guy Rader is sitting in front of me. We work together with him, and he has sent some team to train our entrepreneurs as well as the workers. And 80% of our workforce of 3.5 million are coming from the rural areas. They are very young girls, and many of them will not even visit the nearest town. They come for these jobs, and they need some intensive training, which I sat with the international buyers, and they have agreed to provide some fund for training of these young girls, together with the mid-level managers of the entrepreneurs. There is a capacity gap in factories. Expanding this factory in such a rapid way has created some bottlenecks, which these international buyers are trying to meet the gap through training and through other organizational aspects.
Now, Nigel, you challenged us in your first remarks that we weren't thinking big enough and big. So what should we be thinking about here? What's your agenda? What's your top 3 things that need to be done?
So let me pick up on the informality one
Yeah.
first, and I hope Sharon and I aren't about to disagree, and we'll see the end of a beautiful relationship in front of you.
It might wake us all up in the afternoon.
So Sharon, I gave them the projections for African informal sector, but just before you arrived, that best will in the world, most optimistic projections, 80% of jobs are going to remain in the informal sector over the next 10 years. And the response of many governments has remained therefore we should hire more inspectors, we should coerce, we should somehow try and force people across. So we have this binary view of the jobs world that says informal is bad, formal is good, what we got to do is push people here. It hasn't happened, and those projections indicate, even if they're a bit wrong, that it's not going to happen in any reasonable planning period. I think we have no choice but to think instead of a spectrum rather than this binary vision. And if I'm an employer in the informal sector, I'm probably a rational economic actor making rational economic decisions. But I'm faced with the same issues as if I was formal. That's to say, how do I get my workers access to skills? How do I get access to finance? How do I get access to power? It's the same list. And it seems to me, if we can bite the bullet, and this is as hard for the World Bank as anyone else, and start thinking about how we get those services to firms that are still just informal, and look at incentives to help encourage them a bit further along this spectrum, I think we're likely to get better results, and we're likely to improve those jobs that are there.
What kind of incentives do you mean at that point?
Well, some of them are fiscal incentives, and you see good examples of that in Brazil and Mexico now. So the first is thinking about informality in new ways. The second comes to this skills issue that we've been talking about so much all afternoon. This is the worst time in the history of the world to be a worker with poor skills or even ordinary skills. But in country after country, and again, we are as culpable in this as anybody else, we have skills training programs that are publicly provided, that are supply driven, and that don't really have the kind of dynamic relationship that you need with the private sector, with the world of work, in terms of what are the skills that are going to be needed in 3, 4, 5 years' time that you need to be equipping workers with or potential workers with. And there's a governance issue here. There are a small number of great examples around the world, and Bangladesh is one of them actually, where you have found a shared governance between public sector and private sector and workers in terms of how you manage those skills programs. But by and large, we have terrible governance models. In particular, I don't know if we still have any Latin American friends here, but we have this model around Latin America of these humongous, centralized public providers who, so my caricature, but it's, I'm afraid, a bit true, is get hold of a retired CEO and stick him, usually him, on the board and say, look, there's our private sector perspective on this thing. And firms just see this as a tax on themselves because they have to pay for it, and then they look at their skills provision separately. So I think we have to think about skills in a different way. And the third, which Amina was touching on the last panel, is a job strategy requires a whole of government approach. This is not something that ministries of labor and employment can fix by themselves, and in too many countries it remains something that's seen as the sole responsibility of that ministry. How do they leverage their responsibilities across government? How do they work not just with the Ministry of Finance, but how do they work with people who are responsible for power, for the business environment, and so on, so you really get a systematic and thought-through approach to the jobs challenge. And there are some countries that are doing that. So Guy and I were in Melbourne last week before, at the G20 employment ministers meeting. Turkey takes over for the G20 presidency next year. Turkey has been approaching this in a very interesting whole of government approach. Coincidence or not, I don't know, but the jobs story in Turkey is a really positive one. partly because there have been so many women entering the labour force in Turkey, but it's a much more complicated story. So those would be my top three: informality, skills, and whole of government.
Sharan, have you fallen out with him over there?
Well, I don't have an argument with the issues. I have an argument with the approach. I mean, they told us 4 years ago, to be honest, you couldn't get on the G20 agenda informality. It took the employers and us to agree to put it on, and even then the employers a little reluctantly didn't have any meat in Mexico. And since then, I must say I'm delighted now that actually it is on the agenda. Now, there are many ILO people here who, like us, have been trying to get it on the agenda for a long time. Now we've got a standard-setting debate that's not going too badly. It'll have a second round next year. And people told us we couldn't change the lives of domestic workers. But we have a domestic workers convention, and you know what? I can tell you the new unions and the new members, but what I'll tell you is one figure. We reckon, we've formalised the jobs of 12 million domestic workers in just 3 years since the convention. And it's been done with social protection and minimum wages and rights where you can go to get compliance. So a lot of the things about, I'm interested in inspectorates, but I'm interested in compliance. Because if you have the labour market rules, then you can more easily, and you've got compliance, you more easily see where people, and they will, Nigel, fall out of this environment. But if we could tackle it sector by sector on just informality, if you can get the major brands, and I think we can, you know, the major brands tell us that they'll pay a pay rise in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, in place. They want it to be competitive, so they're actually, know that they're not going to pay more than the guy next to them. But we can't get the governments to act on a minimum living wage. That's our challenge. So we're going to organise both at the global level, because the brands are working with us. You're right about that, Minister. But, you know, if you're getting $90 in Bangladesh and the brands will pay $120, which is about a living wage off the top of my head, then, you know, why not? Why are there 300,000 women in the EPZs who have no rights? We can fix these things. These things are fixable. Now, will we turn around Africa from 80% to, 3 or 4% overnight? No. But I tell you what, we can make some serious inroads. 1 million domestic workers in 1 year in South Africa. Go to Latin America, Guatemala, bit of a difficult relationship for us with a government that stands by and watch workers shot, but we are trying to work with them. And the one thing I'll give them, even though we have lots of other areas of disputation, is that with a minimum wage and social protection, they claim, not me, that they've reduced informality by 5%. So let's be serious about this. I'm all for giving workers some incentives, Nigel, but I tell you what, most of the models where people are formalising work, go to India and look at our unions, see what, it's the workers who are doing it themselves. It's cooperatives, it's people taking responsibility for actually building secure employment. So if we take it sector by sector, where there are businesses that need incentive, we've already told the IOE, we're in for that. But we can do something. Just a word on skills. I come from a country, I was a teacher by trade, I spent most of my life, in fact until I left in 2010, I was on the Australian Skills Council still. We can fix that too. Like, if you have the models whereby it is business and unions working to set the skills standards in cooperation, because the workers know the work and the employers know what they want, and you're giving policy advice to governments and to education sectors, you can change it. I mean, people told us in the beginning of the 90s we couldn't possibly restructure Australian business, couldn't create a skills revolution. We did, and we got productivity up to 17% in the value-added sector. These things have solutions, but we've got to get to the point where we reinvest in social dialogue and we have a commitment to full employment and decent work and the underpinnings. And I must just say, can I congratulate those governments and thank them who've taken up the Friends of Decent Work kind of challenge. And please, we need many more of you. So we're going to try and do our bit to get you there. But if governments don't speak out and don't help us demand of the economy what workers need for decent work, I'll just shake my head.
Sadly, Matthew, I don't think we disagree. I think it's a yes and agenda. Of course, I agree with everything that you've said, but I'm also interested in saying, how can we extend social protection to workers who are in the informal sector? How can we extend skills provision there? So it's not one at the expense of the other. And so I think we agree.
I think it's possible.
Yeah.
And where do you see as the next area of opportunity after domestic workers for bringing people in?
We want to first of all purge supply chains of informal work and forced labour. If we can do that, then we can clear the decks for looking at where the other areas are. Clearly, forced labour is still a model in too many countries. Modern day slavery, let's call it what it is. If we can get rid of that, we can also formalise those jobs. And again, the ILO Forced Labour Protocol gives us a tool to organise around. And I don't think there's any decent employer in the world who wants to have forced labour in their supply chains, or indeed even where they're not directly supply chains. We've got a meeting with the employers, the construction sector, with the BWI and the ILO in a week or two. They can actually do something about the appalling conditions in countries like Qatar just by their own behaviour. So we do think you can clean up a lot of this. There's other areas around the issue of how you actually give people the support. It is skills, sometimes it's microfinance, sometimes it's other areas, but when you see what people can do themselves, then, I just want to stop talking about the individual entrepreneur. We're absolutely keen about that as well, but because they'll be the employers of tomorrow. But let's look at how you give people the scaffolding, if you like. If they're self-employed, can they get social protection and assistance? If they're part of an employment interface, then can they get a decent minimum wage?
Now, how does the issue of migration, I mean, we touched on it briefly earlier, I mean, immigration policy, policy around human trafficking at the other extreme, I mean, what should we be aiming for in that respect over the next 10, 15 years in terms of, it's probably an area of globalization that is very unsatisfactory from theoretical grounds and very, very unsatisfactory in practice at the moment. Reeta, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, perhaps not directly on human trafficking, but I think when we look at migration patterns, we can look at migration patterns within a country in terms of what is very well known, the rural-urban migration, and that's certainly true for young people, and particularly hazardous for women, for young girls. I think part of the answer will come back to something Nigel spoke about, the fact that there's a disconnect between the labour market and the providers of service, of skills, who are equipping that labour force. How do we invest in the right areas? So part of that investment also means investment in rural areas, greater levels of, and there are jobs there, but the jobs are not the young people aren't necessarily connecting to those jobs. I do want to pick
So you see that very much as an in-country migration
There's clearly also regional migration, and there's clearly migration, as we know, from south to north. And that's happening, that's clearly happening. But I do think a lot of issues also need to be addressed at the domestic level within national boundaries in ensuring, I don't want to use the word equal, but some sensitive level of consideration in terms of investment in parts of the country which right now is bereft of services in terms of access to finance, access to quality education. These are, I think, some of the fundamental issues which Sharan was touching upon or alluding to, I presume. You were asking about the top three. I think clearly there needs to be a real investment not only in women and women-owned businesses, because they are the jobs of the future. That means access for women to both not only capital, but also to other kinds of skills, mentors, and other investors. That's very, very important. I really do think that there's an important opportunity, and we're seeing some interesting models, different educational models, which are actually having high placement rate of their graduates into jobs, and good jobs, but they are small. And one of the challenges I think everybody here is alluding to is the evidence base is limited, the pilots that we have are small. We really need to be thinking in terms of design for scale, which brings back down to cost per person, the unit cost needs to come down given shrinking budgets and competing budgets.
Thank you. Minister, just on that the migration point, what do you think needs to be done?
Migration, it's a bit complex issues, we have been sending people to 117 countries, and as Sharan was mentioning about the domestic workers. This is an area where we are really in some kind of confusion. In factory situation, informal sector, people meet, at the end of the day, some groups of people are working together. They can talk about their working conditions, and for a domestic worker, things are completely different. She is the lone worker without any communication with the outside world. So what we do normally, we buy insurance for them against any mistreatment, any abuse. So we don't give any people a worker unless she is provided with an insurance. And mandatory one day a week holiday. So this is how we are trying to protect the interests of the domestic worker. For other workers, we see through the minimum wages. In most countries there are minimum wage, but in Saudi Arabia, for example, they don't have any minimum wage. And by contract, we force them to pay the salary through banks, through bank account, which ensures their payment at the end of the month. And when a demand for work comes, we have labor attaches based in those countries. They go and inspect the factories or the workplaces and try to locate.
So these are your government officials working
Yeah,
abroad?
working in that country, They just examine the working conditions and the capacity of the employers. And based on his recommendations, we select people for work there.
Okay. We're pretty much out of time, but just a last word from you, Nigel, and then Sharan.
So just on the migration issue, I mean, if you keep your economist hat firmly on, we'll all agree, we're more or less comfortable with free movement of capital, with certain exceptions, so we should be reasonably comfortable with similar free movement of labor. But of course, it runs headstrong into some political realities. Again, just in Australia, and had a day of discussions on Pacific Islands job strategies. And actually, for a lot of Pacific Islands, the job strategy is labour mobility to Australia and New Zealand, and it's a very sensitive political domestic topic in those countries. So it's not straightforward. Let me just say two things about it. The first is, so the often cited example is for aging populations, where elder care is clearly an area where a migrant population could get lots of jobs. I was recently talking to an Eastern European woman who said to me, when I get to the stage where I can't take my bath by myself anymore, I would prefer a robot to do it than to have some stranger doing it to me. So there are cultural issues just as much as political ones, personal cultural ones. And in the same way, I would say women and men experience the issues around migrant labor in very, very different ways. And we have to be really careful how we think about the migrant labor debate, because for women it can be a deeply troubling experience, and there's a big debate here. And I don't think anyone's got any clean answers for it, but it runs so strongly into both political and cultural sensitivities.
I'll give you the final word, Sharan.
Oh, on migration, my goodness. I mean, I first did the Global Commission for Migration with the previous Secretary General, and we had high hopes. I can't even remember the years, I think 2003, 4, 5, we had a series of debates at the UN. We had a terrific set of discussions at the ILO where the employers and workers actually agreed A to Z, and it was the governments who really thought, particularly European governments, who thought we'd you know, created a revolution because we were talking about, you know, serious management of cross-border migration. But it does come back to a couple of things. The first thing is that we've got to be serious about why is it that people seek migration. Nobody seeks, I mean, you know, there are a few people who are adventurers in the world and they want to go out and find other shores. But the bulk of people, if you look at the stats, and I always say this to corporations globally, you know, the overwhelming majority of people almost universally don't move more than 10 or 20 kilometres from their own home. Why do migrants move? Because there's no opportunity. They're either fleeing from conflict, they'll increasingly flee from climate impact, or they flee in our world, in my world, for economic reasons. They want a job. So if we could get full employment and decent work with all of our heads devoted to how you deliver that, then we would actually do something about the migration problem. But in the meantime, it's a little like forced labour. I think any government, any employer who denies people equal treatment, no matter where they are, for us a worker is a worker is a worker. And when they're denied equal treatment to the laws of the land in which workers work, provided they respect fundamental rights, then there's something wrong with our humanity. So it's a huge question. Many people in this room have spent years on it. But can I just say something about the trafficking angle? You know, we don't do enough on compliance. None of us. No governments, not ourselves. You know, this is evil stuff. It's really evil stuff. And unless we actually do more about the criminality of, you know, forced labour, trafficking, those things, people should go to jail. They should go to jail for a very long time. And yet they don't. So, you know, I'm a kind of fear and rules girl, really. If you've got the rules, then let's look at the fear. The final thing is women, and I think we have to be serious about this. Ironically, I think, notwithstanding some of the terrible impact the IMF policies have had on collective bargaining and demand and jobs, Christine Lagarde has been doing a terrific job about promoting women's inclusion. There have been many before her who've done this, and there'll be others. But if you want to get growth in the global economy, and women are going to participate in equal numbers, which is one of the fastest pathways to growth, then you've got to look at the care economy. You have to look at the fact you get a double win. But it can't be personalised or individual care that you don't have a decent job from. It's got to be looking at how you manage, whether it's in-home care for aged relatives or childcare, or whether it's health or education. This is a critical area. Just like we've got infrastructure on the agenda, we now need to get the care economy well and truly there in terms of the jobs future.
Okay, well, this has been a very wide-ranging, challenging discussion. Thank you very much.